hey felek saldın beni cevri cepağa hey felek saldın beni cevri cepağa derdim bulgaç yıglap deme sen bir vapağa derdim bulgaç yıglap deme sen bir vapağa derdim bulgaç yıglap deme sen bir vapağa
Welcome, window to China Cable TV. I have distinguished guest today, Ambassador David Shinn. David Shinn is a professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Previously, he was ambassador to the Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and the Director East Africa Affairs at the State Department. Welcome to you. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Very pleased to be here. And I'm David Shinn, currently an adjunct professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Previously was ambassador to Burkina Faso and to Ethiopia and director of East African Affairs at the State Department.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Magazine editor and writer, journalist.
My name is Winslow Robertson, and I'm the founder and director of Cowries and Rice at China-Africa Strategic Consultancy.
Welcome to you. So today's topic, we're going to talk about the relations of Africa and China. Some Chinese officials and scholars, they talk about China and Africa relations being a win-win position. What do you identify the position of relationships?
Well, it's a very common use of terminology by China to describe the relationship between China and Africa as win-win. And in many cases, that's accurate, and I would have no problem with that description. But one has to be a little careful in some cases. One of the most engaging aspects of Chinese activity in Africa is the building of large infrastructure projects around the continent. China has become Africa's builder, if you will. But if you look at these arrangements, they're not exactly what I would call just a win-win arrangement, in that what happens is that China provides a very large loan, a concessionary loan, for several billions of dollars to build roads and railways and dams and bridges. That loan is paid back usually by sending raw materials back to China, oil or minerals. So if you leave it at that, it's win-win. In other words, China builds the infrastructure, and the Africans are quite happy with that. In turn, China receives oil or minerals. So that's win-win, and both sides are happy. But it goes beyond that, because all of these infrastructure projects, by contract, are tied to Chinese companies. So it's actually a Chinese company that comes in and builds all of these things, which gets paid with the loan provided by the government of China or the Export-Import Bank, and that is required by the contract. In other words, it cannot be a German company or an American company or an African company. In addition to that, there's always a component of Chinese labor involved. It varies from project to project. It might be 10%, it might be 40% Chinese labor. So then you've got a couple of more wins for China here. So what is described as a win-win project or a win-win relationship may be win-win-win. One win for Africa and a couple of wins for China. There are other elements of the relationship where I think it truly is win-win. It's very equal. But in the area of infrastructure building, which is one of the most major activities that China has in all of Africa, I would argue that it's win-win-win.
Oh, thank you for explaining that. What are the principles of China's strategies in Africa?
Well, there are many principles that are involved. Some of them go back in time. Some of them are being updated literally as we sit here today. Perhaps the major principle is a support for the concept of state sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And even though there are some minor modifications going on with that principle, that remains a very important component of what China is doing in Africa. It basically will support whatever government is in charge, and when the Africans decide for whatever reason to change their governments, whether it's going from a democracy to a dictatorship or a dictatorship to a democracy, really makes no difference as far as China is concerned. It accepts the new government pretty much as it is. There's a great reluctance to engage in the internal political affairs of African countries, although even here, in the case of Sudan and South Sudan, for example, there are some nuanced changes taking place where China is becoming increasingly concerned about developments, particularly in South Sudan, where it has very large oil interests, where behind the scenes there may be more engagement than there would have been 5-10 years ago. On the issue of human rights and democratization, there are some sharp differences between the Western countries, the United States in particular, and China. And China's position remains to stay out of those kinds of issues, leave it to the Africans, which is a very sharp difference with the Western countries.
Follow up on an earlier point you made about building infrastructure. As we've seen in the United States and elsewhere, it's one thing to build infrastructure, roads, bridges, and so on. It's another thing to maintain them. What provisions does China have? Is it teaching or training the people in the African countries how to maintain the infrastructure, or does China also structure it so that the countries are dependent upon China for the maintenance of the infrastructure?
You know, it all depends on how the contract is written and what is signed between the government of China and the government of any particular African country. And this is going to vary. Some of the contracts will have a maintenance provision in them where China will continue over a period of time to provide maintenance. I think in most cases that's not what is happening. In most cases it's the African governments who are expected to maintain the roads or the bridges, and sometimes that doesn't happen. And like with any infrastructure project, eventually it's going to wear out.
Right. And
some are going to wear out sooner rather than later. Again, this depends largely on the terms of the contract. If an African government contracts for a cheap road with China, it will get a cheaply built road.
Okay.
And it may not last very long. But that's going to be the decision of the African government, not the decision of the Chinese company that builds the road. If they want a very heavy-duty, long-lasting road that costs more, China will build that too. I think the distinction is that Western companies might be reluctant to build cheap roads that they know are not going to last very long, just because they would be concerned about their reputation. Chinese companies are less concerned about that, and if you want a cheap road, you'll get a cheap road.
Gotcha.
Ambassador Shinn, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about sort of the history of engagement and the politics of Taiwan, and that's something that a lot of people might not really know about.
Yeah, this is a very important component of the China-Africa relationship. It's not much talked about today because today there are only 3 countries in Africa that recognize Taiwan. You have Swaziland, Burkina Faso, where there's been a recent government change, and maybe there will be a change in approach towards recognition of Taiwan, and Sao Tome and Principe, a little island in the Atlantic. Until December of 2013, Gambia also recognized Taiwan. It broke relations with Taiwan, thinking, I suspect, that the Beijing would then quickly recognize Gambia. That has not happened. Now that's a very interesting development in and of itself, and what you've had going on since the election of President Ma in Taiwan in 2008 has been effectively a diplomatic truce between Taipei and Beijing over diplomatic recognition around the world. It used to be that each country was trying to steal away the diplomatic representation of the other country. Now, in recent years, obviously, the vast majority of countries have recognized Beijing, and only a small number continued to recognize Taipei. So it wasn't much of a diplomatic battle, even 4 or 5 years, or even going back to 2008. But since 2008, there has not been any effort that I'm aware of by either Beijing to take away diplomatic recognition that is now accorded to Taiwan, or vice versa. And that policy seems to be holding up. But it does not take away from the basic policy of China, which is very strongly focused on one China policy. That is, we only really accept the diplomatic recognition of Beijing, and that Taiwan is an integral part of mainland China. So that hasn't changed. It's just the relationship between Taiwan and China is fairly cordial at the moment, and that has played out in Africa along more cordial lines.
China very much encouraged Chinese companies to build infrastructure in Africa. What about some other areas like education, media, something like that?
Yes, I mean, to China's credit, they went into Africa to build infrastructure because Western countries were not offering to finance the building of infrastructure. Western companies are more than happy to build the infrastructure if someone will pay them to build, but they weren't able to come up with financing, or at least sufficient financing, from Western governments. And even the World Bank was drawing back somewhat from financing of infrastructure projects. So China walks in and says, we will provide concessionary loans to do the building of infrastructure. And the Africans were very pleased to hear that. But you're quite right, there are many other areas where China is deeply engaged in Africa and has been for the last 15 years or so. For example, in the area of investment, China is becoming a major investor of foreign direct investment on the African continent. In some countries, like Ethiopia, it has become the #1 investor in the country. The United States is quite far down the line in terms of investment dollars going into Ethiopia today. In the form of aid, China has become a significant player in providing what would be the equivalent of OECD aid to Africa. It's estimated to be in recent years about $2 billion a year, which is a sizable sum. As compared to the United States, it's about $8 billion a year of OECD equivalent aid. So the United States is still by far the largest provider of aid to Africa. But China's making a significant contribution on aid. In the educational field, China's offering about 5,000 fully paid scholarships to Africans per year to complete a bachelor's degree in China. This includes 4 years of education and 1 or 2 years of learning Chinese. That's a huge program, and as a result, you're getting significantly increased numbers of Africans going to China for education. China is establishing Confucius Institutes around Africa. Today there are about 40. There are 54 African countries, so today you don't even have one per country. But it's a growing number, and it's making its own contribution.
Speaking of the aid, investment, and the trade, they are often treated like same thing. I don't know what's the difference between them.
There is some confusion, particularly in the media, about trade aid and investment from China in Africa. They're often merged together, and it gives a fuzzy impression as to what's really going on. China has been the largest bilateral trading partner of all 54 African countries collectively since 2009, passing the United States. Today, China's trade with Africa is twice as large, more than twice as large, as American trade with Africa. And the trade is more or less in balance in terms of total trade with Africa. However, if you look at individual country trade, say China-Nigeria, China-Kenya, China-South Africa, then you have significant disparities in trade surpluses and trade deficits. China's trade is largely in balance with maybe 15 countries on the continent. About 15 African countries have a very large surplus with China because they export oil and minerals to China. And the remaining countries tend to have very large trade deficits with China because they don't have much that China wants. In terms of how this gets intermingled with investment and aid, oftentimes these big infrastructure projects, for example, are talked about as Chinese aid projects. They're not, except for the concessionary component of the aid, which is a tiny part of the total loan. They're commercial deals for the most part, admittedly with good terms for financing, but they're not aid projects. One of the reasons that this gets confused in the media is that China often provides all of these things as a package deal. It will bring together aid, trade, and investment all in the same package, and sometimes the media has trouble sorting out what is aid, what is trade, and what is investment.
On top of that, could you talk about the perceived successes of the China-Africa relationship? Because if everything is seen as Chinese aid or Chinese investment, and these are words that are really positive relations, in terms of a large deal announced in the New York Times or in Reuters, how much of that is actually successful? How much of that actually translates on the ground? And how much stock should you put into unannounced airport, unannounced road as?
Well, it's important with all of the deals when they're announced to go back to them 5 years later or 10 years later and verify that they actually transpired as written. Now, in many cases they do. And if you look, for example, at the infrastructure loans that went into Angola dating back to 2001, 2002, the vast majority of those, not all of them, but the majority of them did materialize in the form of roads and buildings and rehabbing of railways, etc. And you can document that, and it's very clear. There are other deals that are discussed, and then they tend to change over time. For example, there was a $9 billion deal announced with the Congo a number of years ago. Well, it turns out that $9 billion deal is now down to $6.5 billion, and it still has a long way to go before it materializes on the ground. There are other deals that are announced, and 5 years later, we don't really hear about them anymore. Something happened to them along the way. Maybe the two sides decided not to pursue them. For example, with Algeria, there was a decision made years ago to develop one of the special economic zones in Algeria. There are 7 that are being developed in Africa, but one of them was to be in Algeria. Well, it turns out that there was a disagreement on the terms, and that special economic zone never materialized, and as far as I can tell, it won't materialize. Now, the same is true with other countries too. It's not just China, where something will be announced, and then you find out years later that it really never happened. But it is important to verify that these agreements do take place, and some don't.
When we speak about U.S. aid, we think of central government making a policy decision and making the loan or whatever. When we talk about investment, very often, or often enough, it's individual companies, large companies who decide for their own purposes that they want to invest, build something, oil, for example. So there's a mixture. In China, how does the process work? How centralized is the whole process, and what are the different sort of components that are working to to make the decisions?
Well, you make an important point on the difference in approach towards Africa by, let me use the example of the United States and China when it comes to investment. In the case of the United States, it's almost always a decision by the private company to go in or not go in. Now, occasionally the U.S. government will help out, sort of greasing the skids, as it were, to try to ensure that the American company gets that particular investment. It may encourage the American company to go in, it may push a little bit, but in the final analysis, it's going to be General Electric or Caterpillar or IBM or whatever that makes the decision, yes or no, and they're not going to really care what the United States government says if they don't think they can make a profit on it. In China, it's a far more confused process. Confused may not be the right word. It's a more mixed process, where you have state-owned companies that have a very close links to the government of China, and where the decision-making may be very much a combination of the government and the state-owned company together deciding to go into a particular investment. And I think there have been cases where the government has urged a state-owned company to go in knowing that the prospect for making a profit was not good. In fact, maybe it was even known in advance that there would not be a profit with a particular project, but for political reasons it was decided that this ought to be done by China for its own political reasons. So you have a process going on that's really quite different than the American system. Now, on the other hand, you actually have more private Chinese companies in Africa today operating than you have state-owned Chinese companies operating in Africa. The difference, however, is that the state-owned companies are the big ones, the ones with the big dollar projects. So by dollar value, it's overwhelmingly state-owned companies that are engaged in Africa. These are the oil companies and the construction companies, for example. The private Chinese companies that are going in tend to be everything from the local Chinese restaurant that goes up, which is going to be very small by comparison, to perhaps a private Chinese mining company that buys up an operation in Ghana, which has actually happened. But it's totally private. You even have a couple of Chinese companies that say they're private, like Huawei, although Huawei has very close connections, historical connections with the Chinese army. But Huawei has an enormous amount of investment going on in Africa, and technically it's a private company. So it's a very mixed situation with China, and very, very different than the United States.
Thank you.
In what fields do you think the U.S. and China can work together in the future?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because this is a topic that I feel very strongly about, and I have been arguing for years that there ought to be more effort at cooperative activities in Africa between China and the United States. In fact, I would argue that of all the regions of the world, Africa most lends itself towards collaborative China-American interaction because it's sort of neutral territory. It's not Latin America, which is America's backyard. It's not Asia, which is China's backyard. In Europe, we have our own established relationships. There's not really too much area for collaboration there anyway. But Africa does require a great deal yet in terms of development, in terms of political stability, and it's in the interest of both China and the United States to encourage that. Now, fortunately, there have already been some areas where there has been collaboration, although it's not always recognized as such. UN peacekeeping operations. The U.S. fully supports China's effort to provide forces to staff up the UN peacekeeping operations, and as I indicated, China has more than 2,000 troops in Africa today. The U.S. has only about 30, they're mainly observers. So this is an area where China is way ahead of the United States in terms of actually providing forces to peacekeeping operations. There was even a case in Liberia several years ago where the United States and China collaborated on building the barracks for the UN peacekeeping force in Liberia. I mean, it was a collaborative effort, one of the few that we've seen in Africa. The anti-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden. U.S. Ships are there, Chinese ships are there. The Chinese ships are independent of the American and the Western NATO operation, but they cooperate. They exchange intelligence. They have ship visits across vessels. They work together very well. On the political side, political stability in African countries is very much in the interest of both countries. And the United States and China are collaborating on Somalia and the UN. The policies are virtually identical. They're collaborating on trying to bring South Sudan and Sudan together to resolve their differences. And most recently, they're cooperating in trying to end the civil war in South Sudan. So there are tangible areas of cooperation so far. The big area of disappointment to me has been in the field of economic development, particularly in the areas of the health sector and the agricultural sector. Both the United States and China bring a great deal to the table in terms of improving African agriculture and improving health services. Malaria prevention, for example. China has areas that it is ahead of the United States. The United States has areas where it's ahead of China. They should be collaborating on combating malaria in Africa, but they're not. And the same with agriculture. China has some very useful components to its agricultural system that are applicable in Africa. And the United States has processes and procedures that are useful in Africa, but we're not really collaborating on improving African agriculture. And there are a lot of reasons why that's not happening, but I think it's unfortunate, and I think those reasons ought to be overcome.
Speaking of the Africa, I always think about Africa is one country. Actually, it's totally 54 countries. That's correct. Then, how is every country's this different situation affect the policy China and the U.S. make? I know you are ambassador, probably have very strong feelings. Why?
Well, obviously, you make a very important point that we're not talking about a single country, and we're talking about 54 different countries, all with very unique characteristics. And for the sake of discussion, we talk China-Africa, but there's a certain erroneous nature to the discussion from the beginning, but you have to focus the discussion somehow, and I'm not sure that if we were to talk about China Botswana relations, there would be that much interest out in your audience, so we talk about all of Africa. But the distinctions are important, and it's critical to look at the bilateral relationships of these countries when you have the time and the inclination to do so, because they do vary. There are some things you can generalize about China and Africa. And for example, China has a good governmental relationship pretty much with all 54, well, with the 51 countries that recognize it.
Wow.
Three recognize Taiwan, so we have to put them aside. But it otherwise has a good relationship with all of those countries that it recognizes, and it has an embassy with an ambassador in every one of them now. It most recently opened up in Somalia, where it has not had an embassy.
Even in Somalia.
Even in Somalia,
wow.
where they just opened up. The United States doesn't yet have an embassy in Somalia.
Since there is more competition, there's more opportunity, especially now it's China's influence in Africa. Thank you all for joining us, and then we will wrap up. See you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.